Something that comes up again and again in our conversations and definitely in the questions you send in is this really big challenge. If you believe in an all-good, all-powerful God who, created everything, how do you square that with all the violence, the suffering, natural disasters?
It's a huge question, a profound one, really. It gets right to the heart of how we see the world.
Exactly. And it's one I know I've wrestled with a lot.
Well, today we're going to dig into a really interesting perspective on this. We've been looking at an article, originally a sermon, actually, by Gregory Boyd.
Ah, Boyd. Right, part of that series on spiritual warfare.
That's the one. It comes from a specific segment within evangelicalism, but the ideas are, well, they're pretty compelling for anyone grappling with this problem.
So what's his angle? What makes it different?
He basically offers an alternative way to understand let's say, the brokenness of creation without saying God directly willed it this way.
Okay, so it's not trying to justify the suffering, but explain it differently.
Precisely. The idea is that creation itself, the natural world, has been impacted by a much larger spiritual conflict.
Right. So our mission today isn't about finding some neat, tidy answer, maybe.
No, not at all. It's more about exploring this alternative view Boyd presents, that the world we see now isn't quite God's original blueprint, that it's caught in the crossfire.
Okay. So let's start there. What's the problem he's trying to tackle specifically? Lay it out for us.
Well, he starts by just painting this really stark picture of, frankly, how violent creation itself is.
Right. Not just human violence.
No, nature itself. Think about those massive natural disasters he mentions, killer earthquakes, like the one in Pakistan, over 100,000 people. Just gone, almost instantly.
Devastating. And the tsunamis, too, right? Wiping out coastlines.
Exactly. Indonesia. And he stresses these aren't like freak occurrences. They happen regularly.
And it's not just the big sudden events either, is it? He talks about the slower, more grinding stuff, too.
Yeah, things like widespread famines, droughts that just parch the land, and, of course, deadly diseases. AIDS, Ebola, the plague. These are part of our reality.
And then he zooms in on something really specific and frankly, quite disturbing. Parasites.
Oh, yeah, the hookworm example. It's visceral.
Tell us about that.
Well, he describes this tiny worm attaching itself inside your intestine, stopping blood from clotting, literally just stealing your nourishment.
Ugh.
And he quotes a scientist who called parasites, get this, humanity's worst enemy. And even mentioned their, quote, demonic intelligence.
Demonic intelligence. Wow. That's strong.
It is, and it drives home the point. That image he uses of the little girl in Haiti, stomach swollen with worms, it's hard to forget. It forces you to confront the ugliness.
It really does. And then there's animal predation, the hyenas and the antelope alive.
Yeah, the raw violence in the animal kingdom. It's not pretty.
So he lays all this out, this catalog of horrors almost, and then he asks a critical question, right?
He does. He points out that many Christians sort of implicitly believe that nature as it is now is exactly how God intended it.
Which leads to a problem.
A big one, because if you say this violent, suffering world is God's direct intention, well, Boyd argues that you're kind of agreeing with the atheist critique, aren't you? Does this creation really point to an all-good, all-loving creator?
It's a tough spot theologically.
Definitely. And that's the setup for his alternative.
Okay, so what is this alternative? How does he reframe it?
He introduces the idea that creation is permeated by spiritual warfare, not just human souls, but the whole system.
So the battle between good and evil isn't just about us. It affects rocks, trees, animals, weather.
That's the argument. And he notes this wasn't some fringe idea initially. He claims it was actually a pretty dominant view in the early church, like the first 3 centuries, before Augustine's framework became more central.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And he uses that C.S. Lewis quote, via N.T. Wright. Every square inch of space and every split second of time is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan.
That really gives a sense of scale, an all-encompassing conflict.
Exactly. It's cosmic. And Boyd looks for biblical support for this.
Where does he find it?
One key example is Jesus rebuking the storm in Luke chapter 8.
Right. Peace. Be still.
Yes. But the crucial part for Boyd is the Greek word used for rebuke. He points out it's the same word Jesus uses when he confronts demons.
Huh. So like he's treating the storm as if it's influenced by something hostile.
That's the implication. Now, Boyd's careful. He's not saying there's a specific storm demon behind every squall.
Okay.
But it suggests that the natural world isn't currently operating purely according to God's original benevolent design. There's some kind of hostile interference or corruption at play.
So the current state of nature isn't identical to God's original intention. That's the core idea.
That's the core idea. It's a creation affected, even wounded, by war.
Okay, so how does he build this case biblically? You mentioned he has several points.
He lays out 5 key biblical arguments, or facts as he calls them, that support this view of a war-torn creation.
Let's walk through them. What's the first one?
First, he argues that God's ideal creation, the one described in Genesis 1, was fundamentally nonviolent.
Based on?
Well, based on God repeatedly calling it good, even very good. And crucially, look at what everyone eats.
Plants.
Exactly. Genesis 1, verses 29 and 30. God gives plants as food for humans and for all the animals. There's no mention of carnivores, no predation.
A vegetarian world, basically. Lions eating grass.
That's the picture Genesis 1 paints. Total harmony. And he links this not just to the past, but the future, too.
How so?
He points to those passages in Isaiah, the peaceable kingdom verses. Wolf and lamb together, leopard and goat, the lion eating straw like an ox.
Yeah, the child playing near the cobra's den. Those are powerful images.
They are, and they represent the ultimate restoration, God's kingdom fully realized, often symbolized by Mount Zion, a future where all this violence is gone from creation.
So if it started good and will end good,
Sure.
what happened in the middle?
That brings us to his second point. Nature is now cursed. He draws this from Genesis 3 after the fall and also from Romans 8.
The consequences of Adam and Eve's choice.
Right. Suddenly there's hostility, snakes and humans, pain in childbirth, difficulty working the ground, thorns and thistles appear, and ultimately death enters the picture.
Things we now think of as just natural.
But Boyd argues they represent a break from the original design, a deviation.
And Romans 8.
Paul's words there are key. The whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. It's this sense of ongoing struggle and suffering within nature itself. Boyd even sort of links it conceptually to things like the second law of thermodynamics, the tendency towards decay and disorder.
Okay, but that does raise questions, doesn't it? Like, what about animal suffering before humans? Fossils show predation long before us.
That's a huge question, yeah. The problem of pre-human suffering.
And also, if God brought the curse, why does Jesus seem to treat nature's hostility, like the storm, as something demonic to be rebuked? Isn't that contradictory?
Excellent points. And Boyd attempts to address these as he moves to his third piece of evidence.
Which is?
That Satan holds the power of death. He cites Hebrews 2.14, which directly says the devil holds the power of death.
Okay.
And also 1 John 3.8, which says Jesus came to destroy the devil's works. And death is definitely presented as an enemy, something to be destroyed.
So death isn't from God, it's from the devil, in this view. How does that mesh with the Genesis curse, then? Did God curse it, or did Satan corrupt it?
Boyd tries to synthesize this. He suggests the curse wasn't God actively inflicting death and decay, but rather God withdrawing his protective presence in response to rebellion.
Withdrawing protection, like lowering a shield.
Exactly, creating a vulnerability. He uses an analogy from the Old Testament. When Israel walked with God, they were protected. When they turned away, God sometimes lifted that protection, allowing enemy nations like Assyria in Isaiah 10 to come in as judgment.
So God didn't directly send the Assyrians in that sense, but allowed them to succeed because the shield was down.
That's the idea. It wasn't God's positive will for Assyria to conquer, but a consequence of Israel breaking the covenant. He applies that logic back to Eden.
Ow.
Adam and Eve were told to work and guard the garden. Their rebellion wasn't just eating fruit, it was a failure to guard, an opening of the door, allowing the heavenly warfare to spill onto earth. Humanity essentially surrendered its delegated dominion, its role as stewards protecting creation.
So the curse is less about God imposing thorns and death, and more about him stepping back, allowing the already present forces of chaos and destruction linked to Satan to encroach.
That's a good way to put it. Which leads logically into his fourth point.
Okay, what's number 4?
Disease has demonic origins.
Whoa, okay, that sounds controversial today.
It can sound that way, yeah. He bases this heavily on Acts 10.38.
What does that say?
It describes Jesus going around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, specifically linking their sickness to demonic oppression.
All who were sick were under the power of the devil.
That's how Boyd reads it, and he argues Jesus consistently treated illness this way in the Gospels. As a result of satanic oppression, something to be fought against, not something sent by God for some mysterious purpose, or simply a neutral fact of natural law.
But wait, Science explains diseases through germs, genetics, environmental factors. How does that fit?
Right, and Boyd acknowledges that. He's not denying the scientific mechanisms. His point is that the natural laws themselves, as they currently operate, are part of a corrupted system.
Ah, so the laws that allow for things like cancer cells or leukemia to arise are not functioning as God originally intended.
Precisely. The system is broken, allowing these destructive processes to occur. Again, he'd likely say doesn't mean every single cold is caused by a specific demon nearby,
Okay.
but that the overall vulnerability to disease, the very existence of things like debilitating genetic disorders or aggressive cancers, stems from this fundamental corruption in nature linked to the spiritual conflict.
A system-level problem, not necessarily an individual demon for every sniffle.
Yeah, that seems to be the idea. There's a brokenness in the fabric of creation.
Okay, that makes a bit more sense. What's the fifth point?
The fifth point kind of brings it all together. All of creation is corrupted and needs saving. He uses Colossians 1, verses 19 and 20.
Which says?
It talks about God's plan through Christ
Huh?
to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven.
All things, not just humans again.
Exactly. That's Boyd's emphasis. The scope is universal. It implies that everything, earth, heaven, the whole created order, has become estranged from God, corrupted, prone to violence, and is in need of reconciliation.
It really underlines the pervasiveness of this spiritual warfare he's talking about.
It does. And he doesn't shy away from the grim reality of this corruption. He lists stark examples: millions without clean water, people dying daily from starvation or preventable diseases, AIDS, the ongoing toll of natural disasters.
Things that feel profoundly wrong.
Yes. He even includes things like babies dying at birth or mothers dying in childbirth tragedies that feel deeply unnatural, contrary to how life should be.
It's a bleak picture. Is there any hope in this view?
Absolutely. That's crucial. He circles back to Romans 8. Yes, creation is groaning in pain.
Like childbirth.
Exactly. But it's groaning in hope. It's the groaning of giving birth to something new the kingdom of God fully realized.
So we're in this messy, painful, in-between time.
That's the idea. This current epoch is one of struggle, conflict, groaning. But the promise is clear. A new heaven and a new earth are coming, where, as Revelation says, there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, no more tsunamis, no more parasites, no more violence.
And Jesus rebuking the storm.
Boyd sees that as a powerful sign, a foretaste, a glimpse of the future authority Christ will exercise over all creation, restoring it completely, an eschatological signpost.
Okay. Wow. That's a lot to take in. It's a very different framework for understanding the world.
It really is.
So let's bring this down to earth a bit.
Mm-hmm.
What does this actually mean for you listening right now? How should this perspective affect how you live or think? Boyd draws out some practical implications.
He does. 3 main ones, I think. First, don't automatically look for the specific hand of God, like his direct judgment or will in every natural disaster.
Explain that.
Yeah.
Because the Old Testament does have examples of God using floods or plagues.
Right, and Boyd acknowledges that. There are specific instances in Israel's history where God clearly acted through natural events for covenantal purposes. But he strongly cautions against taking those specific redemptive historical moments and using them as a blanket explanation for every earthquake or hurricane today.
Why the caution?
Because it can lead to a really distorted view of God's character. He points to Jesus himself in Luke 13, remember, when the Tower of Siloam fell and killed 18 people.
Yeah.
Jesus explicitly refutes the idea that those people were worse sinners than anyone else. He shuts down that kind of simplistic disaster judgment thinking.
So attributing the Indonesian tsunami or a devastating earthquake to God's direct anger is problematic in this view.
Deeply problematic. Boyd would say, if you want to see God's character revealed, don't look at a tsunami. Look at Jesus on the cross.
Look at Calvary. God's suffering with humanity, dying for his enemies.
Look at Calvary. God's suffering with humanity, dying for his enemies.
That's the true revelation of God's heart, not the seemingly random violence of a fallen creation.
Okay, that's a really important corrective. What's the second implication?
Live with a warfare mindset, not a vacation mindset.
Warfare versus vacation. What's the difference?
Well, a vacation mindset is often focused on comfort, leisure, personal enjoyment, sort of what's in it for me. And look, rest is important. God ordained it.
Sure.
But Boyd argues the underlying reality of this present age is one of intense spiritual conflict. We're in a war zone, not a holiday resort.
So that should change how we approach things. It should change our priorities. Instead of just asking, can I afford this? Or do I feel like doing this? The question becomes, What does God want me to do with my time, my money, my energy, my talents in light of this battle? It's a fundamental shift in perspective.
From self-focus to kingdom focus, essentially.
You could put it that way, yeah.
Okay? And the third implication, this one sounds really active.
It is. It's that we are called to actively fight against the evil effects we see in nature and the world. This is spiritual warfare in action.
So spiritual warfare isn't just about, say, praying against demonic forces or casting out demons in the traditional sense.
It includes that, perhaps, but Boyd radically broadens the definition. Fighting spiritual warfare means combating the results of the cosmic conflict, the corruption we see all around us.
Give us some examples. What does that look like practically?
Oh, he lists quite a few. Funding famine relief, supporting organizations that dig wells in drought-stricken areas, teaching better farming or irrigation methods, doing scientific research to improve crops or find cures for diseases or sanitize water.
So science and practical aid are spiritual warfare.
Absolutely, in this view. Also, fighting poverty and hunger directly, showing mercy and care to animals who suffer in this fallen world. Even things like recycling, caring for the environment.
Wow. That connects back to the beginning, doesn't it? That first command in Genesis.
Exactly. Genesis 1.28. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over creation. Boyd sees this fighting back against chaos and suffering as fulfilling that original mandate. We are acting as God's stewards, pushing back the darkness, bringing order and healing where there's brokenness, resisting the corruption.
Okay. So let's try and summarize this whole deep dive. We've explored Gregory Boyd's perspective on why there's so much suffering and violence.
And his answer basically is that it's not God's original plan or direct will. It's the collateral damage, the consequence of a vast spiritual war that has infected all of creation.
A creation that is groaning, but also hoping.
Right. And the takeaway for us, for you listening, is twofold, really. First, adjust how you see God in relation to suffering, look to Christ, not disasters. Second, adopt this warfare mindset.
Which means actively engaging in the fight against the negative effects of this conflict in the world, whether that's through aid, science, advocacy, compassion.
All of the above. It's about participating in the resistance, aligning ourselves with God's ultimate purpose to heal and restore everything.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. How does hearing this perspective shift your understanding, both of the huge challenges we see in the world, climate change, disease, poverty, violence, and maybe your own part in responding to them?
Yeah, could it be that your everyday choices, your work, how you spend your resources, how you treat others, even how you care for the patch of earth around you, could these be seen not just as mundane actions, but as small, perhaps, but significant acts of spiritual resistance, acts that push back the darkness and align with God's work of making all things new?
Something to definitely chew on.